Today I wanted to talk about this book, The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter. Nell Irvin Painter is an American historian who was born in 1942, originally in Houston, Texas, but her family then joined the Great Migration and moved to California, where most of her primary education took place. She ended up getting a master's and a PhD from Harvard and ended up teaching at places such as the University of Pennsylvania, at Chapel Hill, and then spent most of her career at Princeton. So she starts off in the introduction explaining what led her to write this book. And so she talks about how, especially in the field of ethnic studies, African American history, we have a great deal of information and books written on the immigrant experience, on the Black experience, understanding what it is to be a racialized person within the United States. But less attention has been granted towards the construction of the white race in the United States and how that came to be historically. And so that's what her book aims to do. So first of all, she tries to complicate the category of white, the white race. And she says, of course, that hundreds of years ago within European societies, that was definitely not a concept that people were organized around. In the first chapter, she's talking about how she quotes that evolutionary biologists now reckon that all the people on Earth share the same small number of ancestors living 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. And so the idea of any kind of purity of race or genetics is really not accurate because humans do share such few ancestors. And so she focuses our attention to this map that she places on page 3, the Black Sea region. And so this is the area where Turkey, Greece, these kinds of areas were the homelands for the people that would later come to be known as Caucasians. And she later in the book will argue that that term should not really be applied to all white Americans today or white Europeans because they do specify a very specific geographical location. So in this very first chapter, she's setting out on how the Greeks portrayed themselves and the far distant barbarians that they attached certain labels to. And so she talks about how mostly Greek scholars focused on the climate to explain human differences. Humors arising from each climate's relative humidity or aridness explained a people's temperament. And so people were known by the type of land that they came from, and certain stereotypical attributes were labeled onto them because of their geographical location. Tied to this early Greek society, she also really wants to talk about the issue of slavery. And she points to how contemporary American historians really think of slavery based on some kind of racial difference. And she really wants to point back to these Greek societies to talk about how slavery was endemic to these societies and that it wasn't based on any kind of racial difference, and that many of these notable people such as Plato themselves owned slaves, and that she says quite likely slaves outnumbered free people in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. So slavery is inherently tied to this ancient European history. She says clearly to the Romans, it was civilization, not blood, that set people apart. These concepts and ideas about these people start to crystallize over time and over writers who come after them to establish these kinds of ideas about people that become more racialized, more ethnic. In chapter 4, she titles it White Slavery as Beauty Ideal. We see this combination then of whiteness being tied to this ideal beauty. So many of these early white, beautiful women that are painted are depictions of enslaved women. Chapter 5 is called The White Beauty Ideal as Science. And so here we get into the 1700s, the 1800s, and this beginning of eugenics concepts in European study of history, trying to understand what the human ideal is. And she has some chapters, such as chapter 6, where we learn about an author, Blumenbach, who is the first person that she suggests who uses the word Caucasian to describe a white people for the first time. And it's in this dissertation where he expands his taxonomy of the human population and starts to bring in the concept of skin color, which had since up till then not been a central organizing feature. So it's not till chapter 8, entitled Early American White People Observed When We Land Inside the United States. She also points out that the census categories kept changing every 10 years as governmental needs changed and taxonomical categories shifted, including taxonomies of race. And so this really shows that race is a social construct that continues to evolve as the migrants to the United States continue to evolve, and that these racial categories, even when used for census purposes, are quite unstable. And so now that Painter has arrived in the United States, she used documents such as the Founding Fathers and Thomas Jefferson's writings to start to talk about how America starts to classify their citizens and slaves and add a ranking and a hierarchy to these. She also quotes Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, and points out how only after page 370 of this classic book does he concede any racial heterogeneity to the United States. And so therefore his book has really focused on this early white America. She talks about how the anti-Catholic legislation had long existed in the British colonies, inherited from the anti-Catholic struggles of England, and so this was brought forth into the United States. However, she states on page 143 that Irish immigrants quickly recognized how to use the American color line to elevate white, no matter how wretched over black. Seeking fortune on the white side of the color line, Irish voters stoutly supported the pro-slavery Democratic Party. And having slavery as a foundational point in its history, this kind of binary between black and white is established. In chapter 16, she talks about Franz Boas as a dissenter. And so finally we see a social scientist who's not reducing humans to measurements of the skull and wild stereotypes based on thereof. So downplaying anatomical differences between races, Boas looked to environment and culture rather than to race as shapers of people's bodies and psyches. So in chapter 18 and following chapters, she talks about not only is it good enough to be Anglo-Saxon, and so this idea of so-called degenerate families, and a lot of studies start to come out in the 1800s talking about just a bad heredity, bad stock of white people. So even though they're white, they're really not upholding the best attributes of the white race. And so we have this rise in the late 1800s of institutionalizing people based on basically growing up in poverty, but they were, stereotyped based on especially women with sex crimes, but were probably in reality, sexual abuse backgrounds and stories. So several chapters really talk about this kind of development that stems from these racial classifications and ultimately ends up in these eugenics policies. So for example, chapter 19 says from degenerate families to sterilization. So you go from racial classification to these eugenics theories, and then defining people not only based on these binaries and hierarchies of race, but also within the white race in particular, who is considered, supreme stock of this Anglo-Saxon white race, and who are the degenerates, and therefore these folks might be, facing policies such as institutionalization and even sterilization. In chapter 20, it covers the intelligence testing of new immigrants. And so this development that stems from these eugenics concepts of intelligence testing and what is intelligence, and these tools that are created to be given to immigrants and to be given to the population so that we can start to create other categories and hierarchies based on this concept, this kind of made up concept of natural intelligence. Chapter 22 is called The Melting Pot, a Failure. And so she talks about where this concept of melting pot came from in the literature, and also just, of course, that the melting pot was referring specifically to, European immigrants coming to the United States, and definitely not other people that weren't of European heritage. And so chapter 26 onward, the third enlargement of American whiteness, talking about post-World War II and how the immigration laws have shifted, and, the immigration population becoming a lot more diverse, and just how, the transition into formal segregation, restrictive neighborhoods, housing policies, and so on. And so then the book goes all the way towards, the post-World War and the civil rights movement. In chapter 27, she's already talking about Black nationalism and white ethnics. And so, she gets into, in the end of the book, to the civil rights movement and to what she calls the fourth enlargement of the American whiteness. So just these continuous boons that, grow to absorb more people of European and Middle Eastern background into the category of whiteness. So overall, this is a monumental book. It's like 400 pages long, and it's written by, a notable historian. So it's really easy to get into the stories that she highlights of these notable theorists and researchers, and also just these time periods, all the way to these ancient European communities, pre-nation states, and continues all the way to the civil rights movement in the United States, spanning from Europe, spanning to the United States, and overviewing the entire history of racial classification, how different people have been categorized based on such things as, skulls and skull shapes and measurements, and how this contributed to eugenics theories and so on. And so ultimately, overall, what, I would want folks like my students to get out of this book is to understand this entire, like every concept, like the white race as a category, as a social category of organization, has such a long history to it. And so when we look at certain kinds of ways in which race, and specifically white race, is talked about, we can hear these historical underpinnings and these theories that are still influencing how things are thought about, conceptualized, and sold to the public to this day. So that's why understanding the history of the social construction of different racial categories is so important for us as sociologists. So thank you so much for your attention, and let me know what you think.